The Washington Post reports that the Biden administration is quietly encouraging Ukraine to be open with negotiations with Russia. Admin officials are reportedly asking that the Ukrainian officials would stop making statements that they will not consider peace talks until a new Russian president takes power.
While these alleged talks are noted to be, quote, private, in terms of a nudge to Ukraine, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says differently. Sullivan traveled to Ukraine last week to meet with Ukrainian officials. One official statement from the Office of the President of Ukraine says, quote, Ukraine received confirmation of unwavering support from the United States until it gains victory over the aggressor. And a press release from the White House reassures full support for Ukraine and also notes a decision by Sullivan to send an additional $400 million in aid to Ukraine.
Well, this is good news, I would say. This is a glimmer of hope. We have, speaking for myself, I know Brianna feels this way when she's in the chair. Look, there needs to be diplomacy and negotiation, because this war is going to end with negotiation one way or the other. That could be tomorrow, that could be a month from now, that could be a year from now, that could be 10 years from now, or I guess it could be never. But it's not going to end. It's very unlikely to end with Ukraine conquering Russia and deposing Vladimir Putin. That's just not going to happen. You guess you could hope for Vladimir Putin becoming so, kind of out of sync with his inner circle, he gets ousted or something. That wouldn't necessarily mean an end to any war either, and that could make things worse, etc. You just don't know. But the whole premise of this aid to Ukraine that we've been sending should have been, here you go, here is aid so that you don't, to protect your country, to protect your people, but we want diplomacy, we want negotiation to happen so we can bring this to a speedy end, because it's terrible to see all the lives being lost on both sides of this conflict and the broader ramifications for energy prices, etc., and so on, and food shortages in Europe and elsewhere. That should be what we're striving for, and the kind of open-ended, unwavering, no matter what, till the end of time, we will continue to fund you, that the administration has outlined was, I think, ludicrous and is not in line, I don't think, with what actual Americans feel about this conflict. They're sorry for Ukraine. They support Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is tyrannical. That doesn't mean endless support without any strings attached. I don't think that's what the American people think they were signing up for, to the extent they signed up for this at all.
Yeah, Ukraine saying that it received confirmation that it was going to get, unwavering support from the United States until it gains victory over the aggressor. What does that mean? What does victory mean? What is the stated goal at this point from Ukraine's point of view? They won't say. Is it to retake the Donbass, which, by the way, was an independent region de facto when this whole conflict started? Is it to take Crimea, which the United States saw no reason to get involved in that when Russia initially took Crimea back, right? What is the stated goal? We don't know. We're not told. But I think something that's very interesting to your point about American public opinion is that Republicans are showing a real shift, Republican voters, in terms of their willingness to keep supporting this, ad infinitum, with no stated goals. In the beginning, I think the vast majority of Americans, we obviously on the side of Ukraine, obviously the victims of this whole situation. But now, 46% of Republican voters are saying, look, when is enough enough? We have our own problems here. Why is it that we keep sending billions and billions and billions of dollars to another country with no end in sight, no stated goal, when we have real problems here? And I think that shift, right, where you used to have a sort of anti-war left and a neocon right, American exceptionalism, rah, 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 let's go out and fight everybody else's wars for them. You've seen now a shift to where, as you guys have covered so well, the progressives sort of, very timidly point out this idea of like maybe negotiations, maybe diplomacy are a good idea, and had to walk it back in humiliation and bury their heads in the sand, whereas it's the right that's now taking on the mantle of being the anti-war faction.
Well, and to that point, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene told reporters just recently, under Republicans, not another penny will go to Ukraine should they take back Congress. I think that level of breaking with the current policy is probably unlikely, but I like what Kevin McCarthy said, who's likely to become Speaker of the House. He said that under Republican leadership, the blank check will end. There will be no more blank check of support for Ukraine. And I think that's a pretty actually reasonable middle ground, moderate position, in fact. Not saying we're going to leave Ukraine, we're going to hang Ukraine out to dry. We are just saying that the position the Biden administration has articulated, that there will be an endless amount of support no matter what, come hell or high water, until the end of until conquest of Russia. That's crazy. No one believes that's ever possible. It's going to be a more reasonable level of support, and there is going to be an attachment that, like, no, you have to sit down, and if that means something like, Crimea or Donbass independent or Russia aligned, but and then a security guarantee from the U.S. or from NATO, maybe Ukraine not joining NATO, but still getting the protection they would get if they were part of NATO, some kind of thing like that. Work it out. That's going to be the point of any continuing financial support. And that's the Republican position. The Democratic position, as you said, the progressives tried. They tried to indicate that position, and they were forced to walk it back. This is such a fascinating evolution. By far, to the extent there is an anti-war faction, an anti-interventionist, anti-militarist, an anti-regime change faction, 15 years ago, you would have said that there was very little to that. That faction did not exist in the Republican Party. The Ron Paul movement sort of brought that faction into greater prominence in the Republican Party, and then it's kind of been, you have anti-interventionist, anti-hawkish voices in both parties. Not the case. That party is the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is the party of a kind of neoliberal foreign policy, of a kind of nation-building foreign policy that is that, again, it's another case where I just think it's out of step with what actual voters want. With no malice toward Ukraine. I don't want to hear the kind of pro-Russia or pro-Putin apology making is. That is, I think, wrong substantively, and also not at all where the American people are. But it is not wrong. It is not cruel to question whether endless support financially is even good for this, is even helping anyone beyond just prolonging the conflict, and whether we can afford to do it when our own citizens are suffering for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that 2 weeks into this conflict in March, both Putin and Zelensky indicated that they would be open to 3 conditions that the Russians put on the table for immediate withdrawal of troops from Ukraine. Those conditions were that Crimea remain part of Russia, which it de facto is right now, that the Donbass region remain independent, which it was at that time. Now, of course, Russia has illegally called it part of Russia. And the third condition was that Ukraine remain neutral, that it not join NATO, which Zelensky himself said he had gone off of NATO membership. He doesn't want to beg on his knees to belong to NATO. Now, of course, a lot has happened since then. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been murdered by this, Russian invasion, right? That is totally true. The situation has changed. But is our foreign policy to be determined based on a kind of desire for revenge against Russia? I could see why maybe Zelensky has decided, in exchange for that, I now am not going to relinquish, belonging to NATO. I could see why from his point of view, from his national interest point of view, he might want that. But that does not mean that revenge against Russia for what it did to Ukraine, horrific as it was, is a U.S. foreign policy priority. I'm sorry, that's just a totally different conversation. And we have our own national interests. We have our own fights going on. We are gearing up for a big smackdown with China. And I keep thinking that, President Trump was onto something when he thought, Russia would be better as an ally in that fight than as a trumped up adversary who, yes, poses a big threat to Ukraine, but as far as I'm concerned, poses zero threat to the United States, except insofar as we encourage the Ukraine to prolong this fight, and our gas prices and our food prices end up going up as a result of it. Right.
I don't really Zelensky is doing what makes sense from his perspective, I suppose. And he wasn't even he started this as not a particularly anti-Russian voice. He's been sort of radicalized by being in the position of defending his country against an invasion. He can ask. I guess I don't begrudge him for asking for all the aid he wants. That's kind of his role to play. It's our role to responsibly say what we've said here. We're helping you. Yeah, this is unconscionable. You're the victim of an invasion. Here you go. But at this point, it's incumbent on us to say, well, we would love to continue to help Ukraine, but you have to there has to be a dialogue. We have to open diplomatic channels between the Russian government and the Ukrainian government so that we can bring this to a conclusion that will not satisfy either party entirely. Obviously, Putin is not going to desist in this if it's so humiliating for Russia that then he is at risk of losing power or something. That's, holding out for that outcome. There's going to be thousands more dead if we're holding out for that outcome. And if we don't want that, and I think it's morally correct to not want that, then our support needs to come attached with some strings, which is all of what diplomacy is. No one who has ever had the idea that we just have to give unlimited sums of money to our ostensible allies without any hope or connection that this is going to drive some policy outcome that we want. I mean, that's crazy thinking. I don't know. It's wild that it has truly been the Biden administration's stated position of this. Now we're learning behind the scenes. Maybe all along, I guess not, or maybe they've finally been, even though they got all mad at the progressives for putting out that letter articulating this exact policy. Now they're quietly doing it behind the scenes. Maybe they could do it a little less quietly, a little more loudly, and we could bring this horrific war to a conclusion as soon as possible. And we will be back with more Rising in just a minute. Stay tuned.